Welcome back, friends, as we conclude our series, The Fool. Conclude our series, you might be saying, I only missed last week. How are we already concluding it? Well, yeah, it's just a 2-week series, just a short little thing here. You know, the Bible has a lot to say about the fool. And we looked last week at the 2 different categories that the Bible has for a fool. And these categories aren't mutually exclusive. There is some overlap here at times. But last week we looked at the category, the definition, that we had called a foolish life. Right? That's somebody who rejects God, tries to find satisfaction in things or in money or in their own ability, and they're living a selfish life focused only on this earth. And Jesus addressed that idea several different times during his ministry here on earth. We looked last week at Jesus and the parable of the rich fool. That was in Luke chapter 12. This week, we're going to shift gears just a little bit and talk about that other category that we introduced to you last week, and that was called a foolish way of living. The dictionary definition here is one who is characterized by thoughts, behaviors, attitudes, or judgments that lack sense, prudence, and discretion. We're going to do things a little bit different today. This is going to feel, I think, quite a bit different than what I might normally do. It's going to be more of a word study, a deep dive into this word, fool, really focusing on the book of Proverbs for the most part. So hang on, we're going to change things up just a little bit. Now, before we get started, let me answer a question. Why should you care? Why are we taking time to talk about the fool? Why is this important to you? Well, 2 reasons. Number 1, we're talking about a fool because we want to avoid destruction and dishonor. Now, you might be thinking, wow, destruction and dishonor, really, Joel? Aren't you overselling it just a little bit? Well, those aren't my words. Those didn't come from me. We see that idea, those 2 words, all throughout the book of Proverbs when it comes to a fool. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 35. The wise will inherit honor, but he holds up fools to dishonor. Or how about chapter 10, verse 14? The wise store up knowledge, but the mouth of the fool hastens destruction. You know, it's kind of like the book of Proverbs is saying we've got 2 paths here, 2 options. Which one are you going to go down? We've got this path over here that's, let's call it preservation and honor, and this path, destruction and dishonor. Which one are you going to choose? Well, it seems like a no-brainer, right? I mean, really, who in their right mind would choose? I'm going to go down the destruction and dishonor path. We wouldn't choose that. We would make the obvious choice. Go this way to preservation and honor. And isn't the good news that Proverbs tells us how to do that? God gives us the instruction manual on how to go down that particular path. So one of the reasons we talk about this and why it's important for you and for me is to be able to avoid destruction and dishonor. The second reason we're talking about it is to gain discernment. When do you respond to something? Right? How do you know that you should say something? Or how do you know when it's better not to? How do you know when you should push back a little bit and speak up? Or how do you know when it's better just to stay silent, to hold your tongue? Hopefully, these next few minutes will give us a little bit of discernment and insight into those types of situations. You know, social media like Facebook, Twitter, they've done a lot of good. They've made it a lot easier to stay connected with folks. You share pictures. What is everybody up to? Try to encourage one another. But I think there's been some downside to those things as well. I think they've ingrained in us this idea, or they've taught us that, you know, we have to have a hot take about everything. We have to have an opinion all the time. And we've got to always be able to share that opinion. And then online we meet people that don't have the same opinions that we do. And we begin to get into a little bit of an argument. You know, have you ever seen someone change their mind in an online argument? Now, I'm painting with a broad brush there, I know. I'm sure it's happened for some people. But most of the time, if you've ever witnessed something like that online, 2 competing ideas going back and forth in that environment, it usually doesn't always end well, does it? So hopefully, we'll gain some discernment in looking at what Proverbs has to say about a fool. So, who is a fool? What do they look like? How can you identify one? Let me give you 12 identifying features to a fool. Some of these features I've borrowed from Dane Ortland, from something I heard him do once. I'm going to fly right through these. We're going to read one verse about each one, make a couple of comments. This is not an exhaustive list at all, and again, there's some overlap here in these features, but 12 things, 12 ways you can spot someone that has a foolish way of living. So, if you're ready, here we go. Identifying feature number 1, a fool doesn't ask questions. Proverbs 18:2, a fool does not delight in understanding, but only wants to show off his opinions. You know, a fool doesn't like to learn. A fool doesn't come into a situation saying, tell me more about that. Help me understand how you reach that conclusion. I'm not sure I'm getting everything. There's no questions being asked from a fool. He already knows. Already knows all the answers, already knows everything that he needs to know. Maybe you've heard this statement before. Don't listen to respond, listen to understand. You ever been in a conversation with somebody like that? Like you're talking and you can just tell when you're talking, they're there, but they're just formulating what it is they want to say next. They're not really listening to understand your point of view. They're not asking you questions. A fool doesn't ask questions. Feature number 2, a fool answers your questions always promptly, always dogmatically. Proverbs chapter 15, verses 7 and 28. The lips of the wise broadcast knowledge, but not so the heart of fools. The mind of the righteous person thinks before answering, but the mouth of the wicked blurts out evil things. To put this simply, knowledge is found with the wise. By thinking before you speak, your words are more appropriate, they're more timely. There's a lot of regrets that you can save by thinking before you speak. Boy, how many times have there been in my life, and maybe in yours too, where I've just said things without thinking, and I'm like, I wish I would have thought about that ahead of time. I wish I could go back and do that again. You know, the NIV puts this verse that the mouth of the wicked gushes out evil things. It just comes right out, flows right out. They're not stopping to think about your question. Number 3, a fool can't bring himself to say, I don't know. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 14, a discerning mind seeks knowledge, but the mouth of fools feeds on foolishness. Someone with discernment, that is someone who can judge well, who understands the situation, he knows what he doesn't know. He's continually seeking out that knowledge. I don't know that. I need to find out more about that. But the fool is the opposite. You very rarely will hear the fool say, I don't know. The fool feeds on, this verse says. Literally, it means it grazes on. He's content with his foolishness. The opposite of discernment. Number 4, a fool does not listen well. Look at how Proverbs sets up the wise. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 8. Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and don't reject your mother's teaching. Listen, sons, to a father's discipline, and pay attention so that you may gain understanding. Listen, my son. Accept my words, and you will live many years. My son, pay attention to my words. Listen closely to my sayings. My son, pay attention to my wisdom. Listen closely to my understanding. Now, sons, listen to me and pay attention to the words from my mouth. And now, sons, listen to me. Those who keep my ways are happy. Listen to instruction and be wise. Don't ignore it. Listen, 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 listen. Listen is to give one's attention to. Right? To regard something as important. I am here in front of you and you are speaking to me and I am listening to you because you're important and what you have to say is important and I want to understand and so I'm listening to you. You know, research suggests that the average person hears between 20,000 and 30,000 words during a day. The average number of words that you're able to listen to per minute is around 450. And of those words, people usually only remember between 17 and 25%, research says. We don't remember a lot of what we hear. The odds are stacked against you. It takes work. It takes understanding. It takes a belief that, hey, I have something to learn from you, so I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to regard what you're saying as important. You don't see the fool doing that. Number 5, a fool has to learn the hard way. Proverbs 27:12, a sensible person sees danger and takes cover. The inexperienced, they just keep going and are punished. What's one way that the wise see danger? Well, through the warnings of others. But they're not going to grasp those warnings if they're not listening. Right? If they're not regarding them as important, if they think they already know all of the dangers and there's nothing for them to learn, the fool's just going to keep going. Has to learn the hard way. But the wise can avoid those things. Number 6, a fool arrives at a conclusion without hearing the whole story. Chapter 18, verse 13, the one who gives an answer before he listens, this is foolishness and disgrace for him. There's kind of an arrogance that's happening here for the fool, right? It shows either that he's unwilling to receive instruction, or there's some sort of prejudice or an unwillingness to hear contrary opinions, or maybe there's an assumption going on that you already know everything there is to know. I have nothing else to learn. I can give you my answer before I've even listened to the whole thing. A fool arrives at a conclusion without hearing the whole story. And number 7, a fool's words are depleting, not nourishing. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 11, the mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. You ever spent time talking to a fool? You ever spent time talking to someone who's just not nourishing in their words? And you leave them and you just feel depleted, empty. But then you spend time with somebody who's wise, somebody who's an encourager, somebody who fills your tank rather than empties it when they speak to you, someone whose words of wisdom are just free-flowing, and it's just refreshing to sit in a conversation with somebody like that, isn't it? You're traveling across the desert of life, and you're hot, and you're tired, and you come across a cool spring, and how refreshing that would be. That's what it's like to sit with someone who's wise. A fool is the opposite. How about number 8? A fool makes decisions alone. Proverbs 11:14, without guidance, a people will fall. But with many counselors, there is deliverance. The word guidance here is a nautical term. It was talking about used for steering a ship. The steering or the counsel of advisors can be helpful to us. That's what the counselors are there for, to help try to steer us in the right direction, or are we headed the right way? And someone who's wise is open to others' opinions. They're open to receiving counsel from other people. And if you've got a group around you, if you've got counselors around you that never say no to you, that never push back on you a little bit, then you don't have the right group. Number 9, a fool can't or won't consider a rebuke. Proverbs chapter 17, verse 10, a rebuke cuts into a perceptive person more than 100 lashes into a fool. Think about that word picture for a moment. One rebuke, one disagreement, one criticism cuts more into a person of wisdom than 100 lashes would cut into a fool. The fool's not interested in that. The fool doesn't have time for your disagreement or your criticism. Proverbs chapter 9, verse 8, don't rebuke a mocker or he will hate you. Rebuke the wise and he will love you. A wise person is sensitive. A wise person learns easily, readily, eagerly, while a fool is thick-headed. They're unresponsive, even sometimes after just extreme measures of correction. Now, let me give an aside here for just a moment and answer a question maybe that's come to mind as we've been talking. Does this mean that we need to take in everything that's said to us? Right, like, Joel, are you saying that a wise person just accepts everything? Well, the answer here is no. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 15 says, "The inexperienced one believes anything, but the sensible one watches his steps." In other words, when you receive a criticism, when you receive a disagreement, we should be willing to learn from it. Is there some truth that's happening here? Is there something that I need to learn, something that I need to adjust? It doesn't mean you just blindly accept everything, but we cross that line from wisdom to foolishness when we don't even receive the rebuke. We don't even receive the disagreement. We don't have anything to learn from that. Does that make sense? Number 10, a fool must win. Proverbs chapter 29, verse 11, "A fool gives full vent to his anger, but a wise person holds it in check." Holds it in check there literally means to calm it back, calm the anger back like you were calming a storm. This verb is only used two other places in the Bible, where both times it refers to calming the sea's waves. And notice here in this verse, it's not that there aren't emotions or sometimes anger or strong feelings for the wise one. Those feelings will come in, but he knows the appropriate time to keep it still, to hold it back. Unlike the fool, who every time you talk to them, they have to let loose. They have to vent. They have to be forceful in their opinions. They have to win. Number 11, a fool makes known their displeasure. Proverbs chapter 12, verse 16, "A fool's displeasure is known at once, but whoever ignores an insult is sensible." There's no self-control when it comes to a fool. If a fool's unhappy, you're going to know it. Last one, number 12. A fool hasn't considered that this list might be about him. Proverbs chapter 12, verse 15, "A fool's way is right in his own eyes, but whoever listens to counsel is wise." I think it's a normal reaction, maybe a little bit of human nature, that when we're going through a list like this, we kind of make the assumptions that we're probably talking about somebody else, right? We're not talking about me. For each one of these points that we've gone through, you might have said, "I hope so-and-so is listening to this." Or it would be really good if they heard this. I'm going to send the link of this YouTube video to them and say, "Be sure you watch point number," whatever it might have been. And there's a part of that where that's true to a degree. I mean, we did say that one of the reasons that we're talking about this is we're trying to learn how to gain some discernment. How do we learn better how to engage the people around us? So there's part of that. But don't forget the first reason we said we were going through this list, right? Is to avoid destruction and dishonor for ourselves, to make sure we're not going down the wrong path. And so we should be looking at this list and doing a little bit of self-evaluation first as we are going through these, right? Is there a situation or is there a relationship in my life where I've been a fool at times and I need to make it right? Or I need to get some people around me, some of those counselors that Proverbs talks about, to help me know when have I gotten off track? I need you to speak into my life in the direction that I'm going. Now, as we've gone through these 12 identifying features, maybe you've had a couple of questions. So let me throw a couple out there. Question number 1, how do I interact with a fool? I've identified, I think someone fits into this category. How do I engage with them? Here's the short answer: you don't. Proverbs 29:9, "If a wise person goes to court with a fool, there will be ranting and raving, but no resolution." Or I like the way the ESV puts that same verse. "If a wise man has an argument with a fool, the fool only rages and laughs. There is no quiet." Proverbs 17:12, "Better for a person to meet a bear robbed of her cubs than a fool in his foolishness." I mean, boy, there is a warning. Avoid at all costs, right? If you came across a mama bear that was separated from her cubs and you happen to be standing in between them, it would be like, boy, get out of there. Avoid as much as you can. Proverbs 26:4 says the same type of thing. Don't answer a fool according to his foolishness, or you'll be like him yourself. When someone fits into that fool category, they're not listening to understand. Their mind is made up. They aren't asking questions. They're not trying to learn. They don't receive feedback. We don't need to engage. In fact, it can be dangerous because we can end up in that same spot that they're in. That brings me to the second question where you say, well, what about Proverbs 26:5? Joel, you read verse 4. Didn't you read verse 5? Here's what it said. Verse 4, don't answer a fool according to his foolishness, or you'll be like him yourself. Verse 5, answer a fool according to his foolishness, or he'll become wise in his own eyes. Oh, well, now I'm really confused. On one hand, don't answer a fool, or you're going to become like him. On the other hand, answer a fool, or he's going to become wise. He's going to continue on that same path. So what do we do with these two verses? How do we know which one? Well, ask yourself this question. Are you able to engage wisely, or would you end up leaving a fool too? Let me read some more verses. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 20. The one who walks with the wise will become wise, but a companion of fools will suffer harm. To start a conflict is to release a flood. Stop the dispute before it breaks out. A person's insight gives him patience, and his virtue is to overlook an offense. There's a contamination aspect when it comes to dealing with fools. Fools can just easily multiply. You can easily become infected by being around a fool. And so you ask yourself, when you're trying to figure out how to engage or how much to engage, how far down the road do I go? Are you able to engage wisely, or would you leave a fool? And there may be a point where you go and you do try to engage. You do try to speak into their life just a little bit, and then you realize, nope, this isn't going anywhere. They're not receptive. I'm not going to continue down that road. So last question. How do I avoid becoming a fool? Right? You've read through this. You've seen all of these warning signs. You've maybe identified a couple places in your life where I relate a little too closely to that. Or maybe someone else was thinking of me when they thought of that particular one. So how do I avoid becoming a fool? Let me give you three things. Gene Getz summarized these things wonderfully in his book, The Measure of a Man. 3 ways to avoid becoming a fool. To be a wise person, the first is to have a mindset of humility. The wise person is humble. He knows that all he has, his gifts, his abilities, his possessions, comes from God. Without God, we wouldn't be able to speak, to write, to talk, to think, to make decisions, or do anything. We would not be alive, or furthermore, we wouldn't have eternal life. Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4 says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, right? But in humility, when we understand that everything that we have is from God, is of God. That ties in to the rich fool parable that we looked at last week. Consider others as more important than yourselves. Everyone should look not to his own interests, but rather to the interests of others. So we need to have a mindset of humility. The second thing is to have a mindset of gratitude. A wise person has a proper view of the grace of God. He's grateful for the grace of God. He knows that he was saved by grace through faith, not through anything that he has done. And as a result of that, when we have that mindset of gratitude, we're motivated to live a selfless life, to live a life focused on things of eternal consequence. Titus chapter 2, verses 11 and 12 says, for the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, instructing us to deny godlessness and worldly lust and to live in a sensible, or another word there is wise, righteous, and godly way in the present age. Finally, we need to have a mindset of prayer. To be a person of prayer. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 7 says to be of sound judgment or wisdom and sober spirit for the purpose of prayer. James chapter 1 verse 5 says, "Now if any of you lack wisdom, he should ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to him." We're to have a mindset of humility, gratitude, and prayer. Recognizing that we don't know everything there is to know. So God, would you help us learn? So, the fool. Foolish life, foolish way of living. When you think about that this week, make the obvious choice. Know how to engage the people around you. Avoid destruction and dishonor. Live the selfless life. Pastor Andy's going to be back next week, kicking off a new series. I'm really looking forward to that. Let me just close this series by saying, if you have any questions, right? I know we've painted with some broad brushes here in this series, and especially today, and maybe you've got a situation that you just need a little insight on. Joel, what do I do about this? What about in this situation? What's the best way to engage here? Help me think through this. We'd love the opportunity to talk with you, to help you work through something. So please feel free to reach out, give us a phone call, send us an email. We welcome the opportunity to talk more about this further with you. Until then, God bless you. Continuing to pray for you.